the night shifts always felt different. The silence of the old hospital pressed on me like a weight. Most of the building was unused now, sealed corridors and locked rooms that hadn't seen patients in decades. Only one wing remained active, and even there the fluorescent lights flickered, as if reluctant to stay alive. My name is Adrian Holt, and that night I was the only physician on duty. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, but beneath it lingered something older, like damp wood and rust. Around midnight, I made my rounds. Most of the patients were asleep, their machines humming softly. It was routine, almost comforting, until I reached room 12. Room 12 was supposed to be empty. The chart said so. Yet inside, under the weak yellow glow of a single lamp, someone sat on the bed. A man, thin, dressed in the patient's gown, his face pale against the shadows. He looked at me, but his eyes didn't follow when I moved. He didn't blink. His hands rested neatly on his lap. "Can you hear me?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. No answer. I stepped closer and checked his pulse. It was steady. His skin was cold but not lifeless. "Do you know where you are?" Again, nothing. No words, no movement. I stayed with him for a few minutes, documenting what I saw. A silent patient, responsive only in the most basic sense, alive but unreachable. Eventually, I had to continue my shift. When I returned half an hour later, the bed was empty. The sheets were undisturbed, as if no one had been there. I thought I had imagined him. Fatigue plays tricks, but at 2 a.m. I heard it. A faint whisper, like breath slipping through the cracks in the walls. I followed it down the hall. The building seemed to stretch, each corridor longer than I remembered. I stopped when I noticed red smears on the floor. Thin streaks, almost like footprints, leading away from room 12. They guided me toward the west wing, the section that had been closed for years. The doors there were locked with heavy chains, but the whispers grew louder as I approached. They weren't clear words, only fragments, too faint to understand but insistent, as if trying to pull me closer. I forced myself to walk away, telling myself it was exhaustion, maybe a patient wandering unsupervised. I reported the incident, but the night staff rarely paid attention to strange noises. The guards blamed pipes, old vents, or my imagination. By 3 a.m., I was alone again in the quiet hum of machines. The whispers stopped. When I checked room 12 once more, the patient was back, sitting in the exact same position, as if he had never moved. His eyes locked on me, yet they carried no recognition. I asked his name, but his lips never opened. I placed my hand on his shoulder, and for the briefest second his body shivered, then froze again. I could not ignore the trail of dried blood on his feet, faint but real. I decided to stay in the room with him. My notebook filled with every detail, his posture, the silence, the unnatural chill. At 4 a.m. I heard it again. The same footsteps in the corridor, slow, measured, heavier than before. This time they stopped outside the door. I held my breath, waiting. Then, softly, the handle turned. The door did not open. The handle turned once, then released. The silence that followed felt thicker than sound. I glanced at the patient. He hadn't moved. His eyes, however, shifted slightly toward the door. It was the first time he reacted to anything. I stood, heart racing, and pulled the door open myself. The hallway stretched empty, the lights buzzing faintly. Yet on the floor, just outside the room, the trail of blood continued, as if whoever had left it had been waiting there for me. The streaks curved down the hall, bending toward the far end where a steel door marked the entrance to the old surgical wing. Every instinct told me not to follow, but I did. My shoes echoed against the tiles as I stepped closer. The air grew colder. The smell changed too. Antiseptic, mixed with something sour, metallic, unmistakable. I stopped at the chained door. The padlock had been broken long ago. The links hung loose, swaying gently as if touched moments earlier. I pushed the door open. Darkness. My flashlight cut across dust-coated walls and broken equipment. Old surgical tables stood under sheets that sagged with mold. Instruments rusted into brown stains. As I moved forward, the whispers grew clearer. They no longer drifted randomly. They surrounded me, circling, as if the walls themselves spoke. Words surfaced between the hissing breaths, fragments of sentences. Stay. Cut. Return. Then I noticed movement at the far end. A shadow, tall and thin, retreating slowly. It slipped behind another door. Against all reason, I followed. The second room was worse. On the floor were deep stains, so dark I knew they had never been cleaned properly. In the center stood the silent patient. He looked exactly as before, gown untouched, eyes fixed. Yet I had left him in room 12. I froze. My mouth went dry. I whispered, "Who are you?" He raised one hand slowly, not toward me but toward the ceiling. Above us, the fluorescent light flickered, then went out. In that instant, the whispers turned into screams. Not loud, not human, but layered, like dozens of voices pressed together. My flashlight shook in my hand. I turned it toward him. The bed was there now, in the middle of the old operating theater. He sat on it, restrained by leather straps that had not been there a moment before. His face was no longer pale. Blood smeared his mouth, dripping down his chin. His lips finally moved. He mouthed a single word, "Leave." I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the light. The blood trail thickened, spreading under the door behind me. I knew what it meant. If I stayed until sunrise, I would not walk out. My body would join the stains on these walls. I ran, crashing through the corridor, pushing the old door wide, not stopping until I reached the active wing of the hospital. When I dared to look back, the hallway behind me was clean. No blood, no whispers, only silence. At dawn, the morning staff arrived. I tried to explain, but room 12 was empty again. The bed made, untouched, no record of an extra patient. No footprints, no blood. The security cameras showed nothing. I still work at the hospital. I avoid the west wing, but some nights the whispers drift through the vents, faint and patient. I know that if I ever follow them again, I won't return, and sometimes, when I pass room 12, I feel eyes on me, waiting. The silent patient has not left. He never will. The first thing I remember was the sound of the elevator doors sliding shut. I had signed the papers, handed over my phone, and followed the nurse without thinking much. Everything felt routine, almost boring. A minor surgery, an overnight stay, then back home. I only looked up when the nurse stopped in front of a door. The plaque read, "Room 13." I froze for a second. The nurse noticed, gave a quick smile, and said it was just a number. I told myself she was right, though something in her eyes made me feel like she didn't believe it either. The door creaked as it opened. The room was dimmer than the hallway. Curtains drawn, air heavy with disinfectant. One bed stood in the center, sheets too neatly pressed, as if no one had ever touched them. A monitor hummed quietly beside it, even though it wasn't connected to anything. I put my bag down. For some reason, the silence felt unnatural, like a recording of silence instead of the real thing. When the nurse left, I checked the handle. It worked. The door opened easily, but the hallway outside seemed darker than before. I shut it quickly and tried to distract myself by unpacking. At night, the room changed. I woke to faint whispers. At first, I thought it was the staff outside, but then I saw shapes moving across the walls. Silhouettes of doctors and nurses, their outlines glowing faintly, like light behind frosted glass. They circled the bed, hands busy with instruments I couldn't identify. I sat up, heart pounding. The figures didn't notice me. They continued their work, heads bent, as if the bed held a patient. But the bed was empty. I called out. My voice cracked. They didn't respond. I shouted louder, panic breaking through, and reached for the call button. It didn't work. The red light stayed off, the plastic button lifeless under my thumb. Then I tried the door, locked. No matter how hard I turned, the handle wouldn't budge. I banged on the door, yelled for help, but the only answer was the steady whispering behind me. When I turned back, one of the figures had moved closer. The faint glow outlined a nurse's cap, but her face was blurred, smeared like wet paint. She raised a hand as if to touch my arm. Cold air brushed my skin, sharp as ice. I stumbled back into the bed. The monitor lit up, beeping wildly, though no wires connected me to it. Numbers flickered on the screen, rapid and senseless. The other silhouettes closed in, circling tighter, whispering faster. I must have blacked out. Morning light cut across the floor when I opened my eyes. The bed was neat again, untouched. The monitor was off. My throat ached from screaming. When the nurse came with breakfast, I demanded to know what had happened in the night. She frowned, tray still in her hands, and asked what room I meant. I told her, room 13. She shook her head. There's no room 13, she said. I laughed, thinking she was joking, but she didn't laugh back. She led me into the hallway and pointed at the door I had entered the night before. The wall was smooth, no number, no handle, just blank paint. I swore the door had been there. I had touched it. I had slept inside. The nurse's face hardened. She told me I must have wandered while still under anesthesia from the pre-op medication, but I hadn't had the surgery yet. I checked the hospital map near the nurse's station. I ran my finger down the floor plan. Room numbers in neat order, but after 12 came 14. No 13 anywhere. And yet, I still had my bag. The sheet still carried the shape of where I had slept, and my skin held the freezing trace of that blurred hand. That was only the first night. That night, I refused to lie down. I sat upright in the chair, staring at the blank wall where the door had been. Nurses passed in the hallway, their voices low, their footsteps echoing unnaturally long, as if the corridor stretched farther than it should. I told myself it was medication, maybe the stress. But the air grew colder the moment the clock struck midnight. My breath clouded. The smooth wall rippled like water, and in seconds the door reappeared. The number 13 glowed faintly on its plaque. It opened without sound. The same pale silhouettes drifted in. Their faces were still blurred, their movements too precise, too mechanical. They pushed an invisible gurney, their hands busy with unseen tools. This time, they turned their attention directly to me. One of them reached into the emptiness and pulled out something long and metallic, shaped like a scalpel. My pulse raced. I pressed myself against the far wall, but the room stretched, the bed growing farther away no matter how close I tried to get. "Stop," I whispered. My voice barely carried. The figure nearest me leaned in. I could almost make out features beneath the blur, but they shifted every time I focused. I saw eyes, then no eyes, a mouth, then none. It was as if the face refused to exist. I ran for the door. To my shock, it opened this time. But the hallway beyond was wrong. Lights flickered, showing glimpses of empty wheelchairs, crumpled sheets, and operating tables lined up in rows. No people. Just the echo of whispers following me. I sprinted, counting the doors, searching for the nurse's station. The corridor twisted, doubling back on itself, the numbers repeating. 12. 14. 12 again. Finally, exhausted, I pushed through a door and found myself back in room 13. The silhouettes stood waiting. They had never moved. I must have collapsed, because morning came again like a switch being flipped. The door was gone. The hallway was normal. My bag was at the foot of the bed, as if I had never touched it. When the doctor came for pre-op checks, I demanded answers. He studied my chart calmly. "You're mistaken," he said. "You haven't stayed here overnight. You were admitted only this morning." But I had memories of 2 nights. My throat was raw from shouting. My wrist bore faint marks like impressions of cold fingers. I refused surgery. I told them I wanted to leave. The staff exchanged uneasy looks, then agreed too quickly, almost with relief. At the reception desk, as I signed discharge papers, I glanced at the clipboard. My file had a room number written at the top, room 13 in bold ink. I pointed at it, asked the clerk why it was there. She looked, blinked, and frowned. The page was suddenly blank. I left without waiting for explanations, but even now, at home, I keep waking in the dark with the same cold air on my skin. And when I open my eyes, I swear I see the faint outline of that door in my bedroom wall. The number on it always glows the same. I stayed long after the others had gone. The ward was silent, emptied of voices and footsteps. Only the low hum of the ventilation filled the air. My shift had ended hours ago, but the pile of unfinished documents chained me to the desk. The fluorescent lights above me flickered once, then steadied. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself I was tired, that nothing strange could happen here. Still, the quiet pressed in, too heavy for a hospital that usually never slept. As I reached for another form, movement caught the corner of my eye. A shadow stretched across the far wall of the patient room opposite me. At first, I thought it was mine, but I wasn't standing. My hands were flat on the desk, yet the shadow shifted, arms lifting, head tilting slowly. I froze. The lights in that ward were off. There was no lamp, no source to cast it. The shadow bent over an invisible bed. Its arms moved with deliberate precision, as if arranging tools, a rhythm that felt too practiced to be random. I recognized it, the careful motions of surgery, my heart knocked against my ribs. I told myself to leave, to clock out, and never look back. Instead, I stood, pulled by something stronger than fear. I walked closer, my steps muffled by the polished floor. When I reached the doorway, the shadow stilled. It clung to the wall, flat and perfect, though nothing stood in front of it. I raised my hand slowly, and the shadow did not follow. A second later, it lifted its own hand, mimicking me, delayed. I whispered into the empty ward, "Who are you?" The shadow bent forward, as if listening. Then, with a jerk, it returned to its task. It grasped at empty air, pulling unseen instruments from a tray that wasn't there. The bed beside it, stripped and clean, seemed to sink under invisible weight. I stepped inside. Every instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't. The shadow's movements were too exact, too skilled. I had seen the surgical wing earlier this week. A framed photograph of a man in an old coat hung in the hallway, his eyes severe, his nameplate tarnished. Dr. Keller. Retired decades ago. No, not retired. He had died here. The realization slid cold through me. The shape on the wall wasn't mine. It was his. I backed up a step, but the shadow mirrored me with delay, as though tethered. When I lifted a hand to my chest, it hesitated, then dragged its palm across where its chest should be, a smudge of black fingers on white plaster. The air grew heavy. Machines in the storage corner clicked alive, though none were plugged in. A monitor crackled, numbers flashing across the dead screen before fading. The shadow pushed down hard on the empty bed, both hands firm, as if starting compressions. I wanted to scream, but my throat locked. The memory of Dr. Keller's reputation surfaced, a surgeon brilliant but whispered about. Experiments, methods unapproved. Notes found, scattered after his death, never explained. The shadow paused and turned its head toward me. Not fully, only a fraction, yet the angle carried intent. It wanted me. I whispered again, "What do you want from me?" The shadow's delay grew shorter. When I lifted my hand, it nearly matched me. When I stepped back, it stepped forward, reaching. The drawers of the supply cabinet rattled open. Gauze, instruments, empty syringes spilled across the floor. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something sharp, metallic. I staggered against the desk. The shadow pressed its hand against the wall, pushing, stretching, as if trying to peel itself free. Its fingers lengthened unnaturally, smearing across paint like wet ink. I told myself it was exhaustion, a trick of my brain after hours without sleep. But when the overhead lights flickered again, the shape grew darker, more defined. A doctor's silhouette, bent shoulders, narrow face. A figure I had seen only in that photograph. The clock on the wall ticked louder, each second sharp. The ward no longer felt like mine. I was trespassing in his. The shadow raised its arm again, scalpel in hand, though nothing was there. And still, I swore I heard the scrape of metal. I should have run. Instead, I whispered, "I'm not your assistant." The shadow froze. Then, slowly, it placed the invisible tool down. The delay vanished. Its head tilted toward me, perfectly aligned. The lights above me went out. When the lights went out, the hum of the hospital seemed to stop with them. I stood in darkness, breathing too fast, waiting for the emergency system to kick in. But dim light soon bled into the ward, not from bulbs, but from the wall itself. The shadow glowed faintly, like a film projected onto plaster. It was clearer now, sharper than it had any right to be. I tried to move back, but my legs didn't obey. The shadow lifted its hands, and I felt my own rise against my will. Not perfectly, but with enough pull to make my chest tighten. The old bed in the center of the room groaned. Its mattress dipped, invisible weight pressing into it. I heard a breath, not mine, rasping out of thin air. The shadow began. Hands worked in surgical rhythm, cutting into what wasn't there. The metallic clink of tools echoed, each sound without a source. I had told myself to break free, to shout, to run. Instead, my arms followed the same sequence, slower, as though I was being trained. Each motion mirrored on the wall. My voice cracked. "Stop." The figure didn't stop. It guided me. Each gesture forced, rehearsed, as if I had been drafted into a role I didn't agree to. The monitors in the corner flashed again, green lines spiking and falling. A patient's vitals. I stared at the empty bed, and the numbers matched. The shadow stepped closer to mine until the two nearly overlapped. My outline darkened, swallowed by its. I felt a pressure at my back, like someone leaning into me, their chest pressed against my spine. A whisper brushed my ear. Not sound, but thought, cold and absolute. "Finish what I started." My stomach turned. I saw flashes in my mind, not memories but fragments. Dr. Keller, gloves slick, eyes calm, a patient thrashing beneath his hands. Not surgery. Something else. Something meant to transform. The weight of his will sank deeper. My body obeyed movements I didn't want. I reached toward the cabinet, and this time, real metal touched my palm. A scalpel. "No," I whispered. The blade trembled in my grip. The shadow's hand lifted with mine, perfectly aligned now. Its delay gone. My resistance only fed it. I dropped the scalpel. It clattered to the floor. The ward fell silent. For a heartbeat, I thought it was over. Then the shadow bent down, picked up the scalpel without touching it, and placed it back into my open palm. I stared at my hand, trembling, the blade pressing into my skin. The pressure behind me grew stronger, like a body wrapped around mine. His hands inside my hands, his breath inside my breath. The whisper returned, "You will help me. You are already mine." I staggered back, but the shadow clung tighter. My own shape twisted unnaturally on the wall. Not my reflection anymore. A fusion. His arms, my arms. His head leaning over my shoulder. I thought about tearing free, about running down the hall and never looking back. But the scalpel stayed fixed in my hand, and the shadow's grip inside me didn't loosen. The monitors beeped again, steady and rhythmic. The numbers didn't belong to me. They belonged to a patient that no longer existed. A ghost heartbeat. The bed creaked, sinking deeper, as if welcoming someone I couldn't see. The shadow leaned me closer. My free hand stretched, trembling, to where a chest should have been. And I understood. He hadn't stayed behind to haunt. He had stayed behind to continue. The scalpel gleamed in the dim light, sharp and waiting. I whispered, "Whose body is it?" The whisper inside me answered, "Yours." The lights above roared back on, flooding the ward in harsh white. But the shadow didn't vanish. It stood behind me, taller, heavier, and I realized it wasn't leaving. It had chosen me.